Willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 55 of my game system design series. In this video I'll be discussing the seductive and disappointing world of army lists. This is the second version of this video, and I have to admit I'm mainly redoing it to improve the audio, which was not very good in the original video. I've added a couple of new slides, but otherwise it's pretty much identical to my first version. The video will cover all army lists ranging from ancient, musket and pike, World War II and Cold War. The period is not really significant. It's the initial seduction of army lists to any gamers, followed by the disappointment when you discover it does not solve all the problems you thought it would solve. So, with that out of the way, let's enter the seductive world of army lists. Any gamer will initially focus on the figures followed by the rules. This will result in a period of learning when the gamer will spend a lot of time building up a force mix and then learning the rules. The learning process could be solo or could involve other gamers teaching you the ropes. This process can be enjoyable, but eventually you will come up with two major issues. Building up a force mix which makes sense for the rules and the game, building up a force mix for the game which works. Let's first look at building up a force mix which makes sense for a game and identify what that issue actually is. Often gamers will purchase the figures they like, where the result is that they end up with a force mix which makes no sense at all. Ancient armies will consist of hordes of elephants, Napoleonic armies which seem to mainly consist of cuirassiers or guards, World War II armies which seem to only include Tiger tanks, and Cold War armies which only seem to field M1 Abrams main battle tanks. If the rules are being used are good, such unbalanced force mixes will generally result in losing a game. Gamers will overcome this by creating their own rules which make it possible for a huge cuirassier army to defeat infantry in a built-up area. However, I will not be covering those cases and will assume the rules make some form of historical sense, in which case the cuirassiers will never be able to dislodge the infantry from buildings. Eventually, gamers will want to create something which is historically reasonable, which means they now need to buy all those boring troop types they never had much interest in buying prior. The Napoleonic gamer starts buying Landwehr, the World War II gamer starts buying infantry, and the ancient gamer starts buying mass spearmen or levies. The result is often a force mix which includes a lot of carefully painted figures which will never be used. I have enough cuirassiers to represent all the entire Prussian cuirassier force mixes at a very low scale, and these days rarely use more than 10% of this total number. As a result, the gamers become focused on making sure they initially purchase the correct force mix, one which they will actually use for games. There are various methods you can adopt which reduce force mix wastage, some of which I've covered in earlier videos, but one way of achieving this is through the use of army lists. This does require selecting a set of rules first, but if this is possible, then all you need is the army lists, which you can now use to build out your force mix. The second issue I'm covering is building up a force mix for a game which works. This is normally an issue for gamers who wish to have a game which completes within a day and which has a clear winner and loser. In this case, the gamer already has the figures, he just wants to know what he can deploy for the game, which has clear and well-defined victory conditions. One solution is historical scenarios, which work but do require a different type of army list, which is the force mix for the specific battle or scenario. Another solution is a point system, where each player deploys a fixed points total on the playing area. This does require a point system, but even if one exists, both players will be spending time with their calculator building up the force mix. The other issue is some guidelines of what each side should look like is required, so we can avoid the opposite of my cuirassier in a built-up area issue. No point system in a set of rules is going to be perfect. There will always be gamey aspects to the point system. One way of minimizing this is to use historical force mixes. Thus, if infantry armed with ATGWs have an unusually powerful impact, the historical limits will restrict their use. You can even take this to each player selecting a fixed formation with a points value and a fixed composition. This works with World War II or Cold War, but it generally does not work with musket and pike or ancients. The answer to all these issues is army lists, or a scenario force mix. Putting the scenario force mix to one side, an army list will restrict your force mix to something which resembles reality, minimizing any issues with the point system and hopefully allowing you to more quickly form up your force mix for your ad hoc game. We have now finally entered the army list seduction zone. Now let's look at the disappointment. My first exposure to an army list was Ian Shaw's first edition of his World War II Army Organisation and Equipment book. This was published in 1981 and I used it to build up forces for my WRG Micro Army games. The army list consisted of a THEORIE with the equipment under each formation. The player was expected to use this to build an army list and then to cross-reference the elements with a points chart, also in the rules. This worked, but was very much designed for a player to study the chart and build up the army in their man cave before selling out to do battle in a club. It was suitable for competitions, but for ad hoc games, less useful. The second edition of this book, which came out in 1983, improved this situation by providing more traditional army list guidelines. Players would now build up their force mix based on some general rules and guidelines, which made the job of creating your force mix a lot easier, but it still required some effort to create the force mix. Good for competition game, still not very good for ad hoc games. The third edition, which came out in 1986, expanded on this trend and provided more fine-grained options for players. This basic structure was continued for World War II and Cold War figure gaming until recently, but in all cases it had a fundamental issue, which was some effort was required to build up your force mix, which was best done before the game was to be played. Good for competitions, but not so good for ad hoc games. The trend now changed, and now it moved to scenarios with fixed forces, maps and victory conditions. This did work, but removed the excitement of building up your force mix and experiencing a new and random situation. When I moved over to Napoleonic gaming, the army lists I used were the Horse and Musket army list printed in 1979 and designed for the WRG Napoleonic rules. These were similar to the latter Ian Shaw World War II lists and provided a player with a reasonably fixed list with some variation allowed, although it was not a great deal of variability. This type of army list worked for competition play, but the same issues that I raised before with World War II and Cold War still existed. The trend in this, once again, as with World War II and Cold War, moved to historical scenario. I suspect for the same reason, well I know for the same reason World War II moved in that direction. If we swing over to Ancients, my initial true exposure to Ancients was a set of Australian rules called Anabasis. I only got involved in Ancients because of a campaign and I just used the rules everyone else did. The campaign did not require an army list, but for ad hoc games the rules did contain a rough army list. This did not contain points value and as such had minimal use, except as an idea of what troop types you could purchase and field in a specific army. After my initial exposure, I quickly discovered WRG 6th edition and discovered a plethora of army lists. The format was much the same as the Napoleonic format, but contained a huge array of different ancient armies with different options. Unlike the world of musket and pikes, World War II and Cold Wars, army lists became the norm for Ancients. I expect the lack of good scenario details could be the reason why historical battles never really took off, but the final result from WRG is an impressive body of work. I used these army lists for other rules and certainly used the army list to determine what figures I need to purchase. The issue with spending too much time creating your army list still existed, although in the ancient worlds the common methodology was to build up a WRG army and just stay with it. A few extra units may be included which could easily be swapped out, but gamers would arrive with their Athenian Greek hoplite army and just use their standard force mix of a specific points total to game it out with, let's say, a medieval battle or a medieval army. This methodology does seem to work with DBMM or the earlier DBM rules and the quick play DBA rules. However, many players, while they may like the army lists, may not like the rules as much. So when they moved to another set of rules, they needed to align with another set of army lists. This was generally not a major issue. I must point out that when we talk about the world of ancient figure gaming, the army lists do not disappoint you, but this was mainly due to players' force mixes being fixed. This allowed them to have the all-important ad hoc game with a clear winner or loser at a club. I normally use a figure game conversion of a SPI board game, which uses DBMM troop types and points values, and even in this case, I tend to only field fixed force mixes in the ancient worlds. In this case, I normally stick with 200-point armies. Creating a fixed army list does allow you to build your new army. In this case, let's look at Book 1, List 24, the Hittite Empire, 1380 BC to 1170 BC. While 200 points is the most common for small games, it may be better to build out at 300-point or even a 400-point force mix, as this does allow you greater flexibility, and that tends to be what I normally do. In this case, you need to purchase, paint and base 62 elements to get your army in a state to play a game of DBM or P17CW. It's also likely suitable for other rules as well, as I found a lot of other rules tend to base their army lists on the WRG army list anyway. You could, as an option, place some effort in creating historical scenarios such as Philip Sabin's Lost Battle and Legion. However, these are first board games which then later use figures. The same also applies to the rules I normally use for figure gaming, the SPI pre-stag board game converted into a figure gaming format and using DBMM troop types. These rules were originally designed for historical scenario. However, the issues with historical scenarios need to be considered: lack of repeatability and generally a predictable situation. Players like the random and unexpected effect of point system used in most ancient rules, and that tends to be their preference, which is why I use DBMM army lists and points with these particular rules. However, when we swing back to Musket and Pike, World War II and Cold War, the standard games normally use fixed scenarios with all their advantages and disadvantages. This is because of the disappointment of using army lists. Unless you want to go down the ancient path and just create a single force mix with minimal variation, the issue with an army list is significant for these periods. For an ad hoc game, it takes simply too much time to build up an army for your game. Let's look at an example from WRG Micro Armor. If you wish to build up a 1000-point force mix from this, you can, but it'll take some time with a calculator. A motor rifle company plus the compulsory troops is about the easiest solution, but if you want any tanks, you'll need to get the notepad and calculator out. I used to use a spreadsheet to calculate my force mix, and I had to do it well before any game. You need to go down the path of pre-baking your army list, similar to Ancients. This provides or is an issue with World War II or Cold War because of the complexity of modern warfare. When we swing over to Napoleonics, I have most of the Napoleonic Wars battle army lists in a spreadsheet and can quickly and easily create an army list from about a dozen different sets of rules. But even if we look at this simple example, it would take time for a player to create, let's say in this case, a 20-point army. You could add a 9-point and 11-point core together to get 20 points, but you need to manually remove 1 point from, let's say, the CNC forces. This is actually probably viable because the points values are so low and we're dealing with a historically accurate TO&E. If we decide to use WRG Musket and Pike rules, the complexity goes up a lot. Creating a 2,000-point army list or army will take some time in this case, and you would absolutely need your trusty calculator. However, even in this case, maybe the effort's not insurmountable. In this case, these are not army lists, but instead are TO&Es from Nyhorsa converted into an army list which could be used by figure gaming. They are a lot simpler than a traditional army list. Unlike an army list which gives a player significant variability in order to achieve a wide range of battles, we can pick a single battle, in this case Marengo, and simply use the formations contained in that battle only. You'll probably go over your limit, and thus you would need to know the cost of individual elements so you can remove them and bring the total down. But it's possible. In this example, I can quickly arrive at an army which is reasonably close to 2,000 points. In this case, all my troops are trained. In this World War II example, we're using the rule spearheads and are building a 500-point force mix from a US infantry division, November 1942. 2 infantry battalions and required HQ gives us 250 points. 1 artillery battalion and the tank destroyer battalion gives us an additional 150 points, giving us a force mix which is close to 400 points. As a general rule of thumb, traditional army lists, similar to those found in ancient games, are not very popular among musket and pike World War II and Cold War gamers. However, using actual THEORIEs may allow players to quickly create ad hoc games using something similar to an army list. One other alternative, which is my current preferred one, is to use a random card pick system. In this case, players randomly select cards, modify their entry game term, which affects their points, and builds up a force mix and reinforcement schedule. This is the easiest system to allow players to create ad hoc force mixes, but in order to keep both sides even, some modification of the historical forces would be required. Just as an interesting point, while originally I used a random card selection process, in many cases these days I simply give players the 9 cards and then they simply build up their force mix and reinforcement schedule from all the available cards. This is particularly important to do with World War II and Cold War, although with Napoleonics you can probably still do the random selection process. While I initially started this video with the thought that army lists generally disappoint, even after the initial excitement of discovering them, my thoughts have altered a bit. For ancients, I can see how army lists do work, as long as you fix your army with only some minor modifications permitted between ad hoc battles. For musket and pike, World War II and Cold War, this approach may work at a low limited scale, such as an element equals a vehicle or 10 men, but once you move up to a scale of 1 element equals a company, it falls apart because of the complexity of those periods. On the other hand, presenting a historical force mix which players can select from can be a viable method of quickly building a force mix, especially for musket and pike. For World War II or Cold War, this is also possible, although I suspect it may only work if you're using a very high level scale or high scale, such as an element equals a company or even higher. After creating this video, I may well convert my spreadsheet based army lists into an army list for rules which can be used by players to quickly put together an ad hoc force mix. A recent development, from my point of view, has been my attempt to create army lists directly from THEORIEs, mainly using the Niehorster THEORIEs. I have only done this for World War II and will likely do it for Cold War as well, but other periods or earlier periods may be possible, although at the present moment I think probably too difficult. This shows the output from my effort, in this case a UK 1945 structure infantry division. It converts the THEORIE into battalion-size elements for a battalion-scale set of rules, that is, rules where every element equals a battalion. I typically use this spreadsheet to create my cards, my player cards, for my card-based ad hoc scenario generating system. But as an experiment, I used it to create divisional-sized army lists for World War II. This is an example of the output, in this case a Polish 1939 infantry and cavalry brigade. I'm not certain if this will actually work, as the card-based system is much easier, quicker and cleaner, but it does show, if you really think long and hard enough, perhaps the traditional army list system could work for World War II and Cold War. And so we come to an end of my episode 55 of my video on game system design, in this case looking at army lists, their seductive appeal, a bit of history and their all too common disappointment, although at the end a little bit of or a ray of hope. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.